So there are a number of different areas or thematic focuses within the UK's CGC, I'm going to call it for short. And we're starting with a focus on the board. So according to the Corporate Governance Code in the UK, the board should have a balance of skills, experience, independence, and knowledge. Okay, so these are 4 key considerations when it comes to making up your board, choosing who is on the board. There needs to be a balance of skills, experience, independence, and knowledge. An annual report should identify the chairperson, the deputy chairperson, the CEO, the senior independent directors, and then the members or chairs of the board committees, which we're going to come to a little bit later. Meeting numbers and attendance should also be recorded. And note, since the 2018 revisions, okay, so there were quite recent revisions to the UK Corporate Governance Code, the board is now responsible for workforce policies and practices that reinforce a healthy culture. Okay, so that's an important new guideline. Moving then on to the chairperson and the CEO. The position of the chairperson and CEO should be separated. Okay, so this is good corporate governance practice, is to ensure the chairperson and the CEO are separated. This is one of those commonly cited guidelines. This is with a view to avoiding the earlier first example of poor corporate governance, which was one person excessively dominating or having too much power and influence in the organization. And of course, if you're a chairperson and CEO, that is likely to occur. At the time of appointment, the chairperson should be independent, that is to say, not hired from within the company ranks. And then we move on to non-executive directors, or NEDs for short. So non-executive directors serve an oversight function on the board. Okay, so they oversee the day-to-day operations and activities of the executive directors on the board, and they do not get involved in those day-to-day execution of company policy tasks. NEDs only attend board meetings or relevant committee meetings. Okay, so they're not involved, again, can't emphasize that enough, in the day-to-day management and operations of the organization. NEDs must be independent, okay? They must be independent from the company and not have been a company employee in the last 5 years, have had a direct or indirect material stake in the company in the last 3 years, participate in the company's share options, have close family ties with executive directors or senior management, and can only serve as a non-executive director and have for more than 9 years, okay? Oh, and finally, sorry, before I move on, have cross-directorship. This is an important one. Basically, this is the idea that these NEDs cannot have a conflicting commitment on another board, okay? They cannot be executive directors on another board for another organization, okay? They cannot have an executive function on another board in another organization. Now, there are other aspects of NEDs which we must cover here. It is generally recommended that at least 50% of the board is comprised of NEDs. Okay, so you want to ensure there's balance between executive directors and non-executive directors. Although for smaller organizations, for smaller companies, they're simply expected to have at least 2. Okay, so not necessarily a perfect balance between executive directors and non-executive directors. Now, bear in mind throughout all of this, okay, when you see words like must and should and so on, these are recommendations and guidelines. That is to say, if someone wants to comply with the Corporate Governance Code in the United Kingdom, they have to follow these principles if they're going to say that they actually comply with these guidelines. But it's not actually mandatory, legally speaking, for them to adopt this framework. So one of the non-executive directors should be appointed as a senior independent director, serving as the direct contact for shareholders or the liaison with shareholders who wish to raise issues outside the formal channels of communication with the board. Okay, so this senior independent director is a NED who is there as a kind of go-between between the shareholders, an informal go-between between the shareholders and the board of directors. Then we have nomination committees. Nomination committees are responsible for making or authorizing new appointments to the board. Over 50% of the committee should be comprised of non-executive directors. So again, non-executive directors really do serve very important functions when it comes to corporate governance. You'll see them popping up again and again. And the revised 2018 document states that the nomination committee should be involved in succession planning when developing a more diverse board. Okay, that's to say people from different ethnic backgrounds and gender balance and so on. These need to be taken into account at the nomination committee level as well when it comes to hiring members of the board. Then we have the Remuneration Committee. This is made up entirely of non-executive directors, the reason being that no director should be responsible for deciding his or her own remuneration. And that's quite obvious when you think about it for a moment when it comes to those potential conflicts of interest that we mentioned earlier. Again, we don't want directors to be running the company in their own interests or excessively in their own interests rather than in the interests of the shareholders. For FTSE 350 companies, it should contain at least 3 NEDs. For smaller listed companies, at least 2. And the chairperson can be a member, but cannot chair the committee. Okay, that is to say the chairperson of the board of directors in general can be a member, but cannot chair the committee. The chair must have been a committee member for at least 12 months. And then the revised 2018 code states that there should be clear reporting on how remuneration helps the organization to achieve its strategy and its alignment with workforce remuneration. Okay, so ensuring that there is consistency between the kinds of remuneration that are employed further down in the company, further down the hierarchy, and the kinds of remuneration that are being employed at the board level to ensure that there's proportionality. In other words, that there's not excessive remuneration at the board level compared to the rest of the organization. And then we have audit committees. Again, it consists solely of non-executive directors, 3 for FTSE 350 companies at least, and 2 for smaller listed companies. They're responsible for monitoring and reviewing the company's financial controls and the integrity of the financial statements. The committee acts as a go-between for the board of directors on the one hand, and the internal and external auditors on the other hand. And then we have specific duties then for members of the audit committee. And they're as follows: to review the work and effectiveness of the internal audit function, to monitor the external auditor's independence and objectivity, shortlist external audit firms when a change is needed. Okay, so those 3: review, monitor, and shortlist. Okay, so remember, listed companies are required to make the following 2 general disclosures in the context of the UK Corporate Governance Code. Firstly, a narrative statement of how they have applied the principles set out in the UK Corporate Governance Code with explanations, and a statement as to whether or not they've complied throughout the accounting period with the provisions set out in the UK Corporate Governance Code, with reasons given in case of non-compliance. So a narrative statement, basically this is just like a little story of how they have applied the principles set out in the UK Corporate Governance Code with explanations in each case. And then if they've deviated in any respect from those guidelines, they have to give, because of course, as a listed company in the UK, you need to comply with Corporate Governance Code in the UK.